So I'm going to intro Julia here briefly, and we're going to have a quick Q&A, but between us, but also will encourage you to ask your questions in the chat as well, so that we can hit the topics that are really important to you, and the reason why you're joining this call today. Hopefully we'll be able to provide you a little bit of value to help out. Julia, thank you so much for joining us. She is a grief psychotherapist, and live from the UK, as you'll notice from her accent. She has over 30 years experience in her field and the best-selling author of 3 books, and actually just told us that she'll be launching a new book later this year in the US. So she'll be over on our side of the pond. She's got a laundry list of multiple designations, and Founder Patron to establish and launch Child Bereavement UK, which is the leading charity that supports families and trains professionals when a child dies or when a child is bereaved. Julia, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be with you, and I really look forward to the people that have joined us to ask questions, because I imagine, because grief is taboo and death is taboo, people only tend to join these talks if there's something particular for them. So I really want to use the time that meets your needs most, so do please ask questions and we'll do our best to answer them all.
Incredible. So opening up, let's talk a little bit about why you were drawn to being a grief psychotherapist. How did you even find this line of work?
It wasn't what was planned, that is for sure. And I started by volunteering with a local bereavement service, but even then I didn't really know what had motivated me. But with hindsight, I look back, and my mother had 5 very significant losses before she was 25. Her mother, her father, her sister, and her brother had all died very traumatically and suddenly. And my father, his father, and his brother had also died. And there were these black and white photographs around our house of people who were never spoken about. I didn't know how any of them had died. I vaguely knew my aunts and uncles' names. I didn't really even know my grandfather's name. And I had no idea that one of them had been killed in the war. Another one, had died very suddenly and collapsed, all of those things. And what I kind of came to realize is that my parents' generation, whose parents had fought in the First World War, and my dad had been in the Navy in the Second World War, their way of processing grief was to forget and move on. And they never told stories. They never experienced they never showed us what they felt. But when I spoke to my mum, like 30 years later, once I had qualified as a psychotherapist, when she talked about her brother's death and he was killed in Arnhem in the war, it was totally untouched grief. That was as if she was that 17-year-old girl who was told the news all of these decades later. And so I realized that what got me into it was trying to make sense of what wasn't spoken about in my childhood. And one of my great hopes is that we can find ways of having these conversations so that people can get the best support themselves, both before someone they love dies, but also when someone has died, so that they don't think that they're abnormal or that they're going mad. To normalize this process.
Incredible. Yeah, because we so often use euphemisms to describe death and tend to avoid the messy discussion. Why do you think there is such an aversion to discussing death and dying? And we use terminology like pass away. Why do you think we're so
lost? I have a real aversion to all of those metaphors. We don't lose people. We lose our pen every day. We don't lose someone. They haven't got lost. And maybe, we have a faith which we believe they've passed into another place, but kind of passed away. I think we use those to soften the reality of death, that someone has died, and the permanence of it, and that kind of brick wall to let ourselves really know that this person has died. And also there's a kind of magical thinking, which is that if I don't think or talk about this, maybe it's going to happen to other people and it's not really going to happen to me. But of course, that means that we haven't had the important conversations before someone has died. We don't know what their needs are. We don't know what they kind of will want, or the things that they want us to remember, or to tell them that we've really loved them. And as I said before, we don't know that grief is a complex, messy painful process. And we kind of think that everyone else is doing it right and somehow we're failing.
Yeah, so that process of grief, you've spoken about it being, active. So what is that? What do you mean by that, and how do you best engage in the grieving process in the healthiest way?
I like to think of it as active because it's the tasks of mourning is to face the reality of the loss, this loss that you really don't want to be true. And people often talk about time is the greatest healer, but time, like in my mother's case, if you're not actively engaged in the adaptation process, it leaves grief untouched. So, physiologically and psychologically, we are wired to adapt. And it's a kind of process where I think the best model is someone called Strobe, where she talks about the dual process, the loss orientation, where you feel the pain of grief and emote and, remember, and restoration orientation, where you have a break from grief, you maybe go back to work, a distraction, and you oscillate between the two. And the activity is allowing yourself in this adaptation process to move between the two. Because every time you face the reality of it, you feel the pain of it, you incrementally adjust a little bit more to let yourself know, say your father has died or your mother has died. And in that known, you incrementally release yourself to be this new version of yourself and be in the present. And pain, unfortunately, is the agent of change. So pain is the thing that forces us to face this new reality. So as we were talking earlier, through the pandemic, often people weren't physically present, didn't have the opportunity to say goodbye by their bedside, didn't have the opportunity to go to a funeral by the graveside. And so their capacity to grieve was put on hold, really. Thousands of people talk to me about it being surreal, can't feel real. And that's where then you can get prolonged grief disorder, because you haven't done this active process of moving in and out of the pain of it.
Yeah, I love that kind of framework there. And when I first kind of think of grief and kind of talking it through it, there's kind of this very famous 5 stages of grief, kind of first written about by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross 43 years ago. Is that still a valid model, or how has that changed? How do you view that framework?
I mean, first of all, it is valid, that framework, but of course, this was to prepare. She set that framework for preparing you for dying, not for grieving, so that preparation for death, pre-bereavement. And I think what's very valid is, what she talks about is being in denial, being in anger, feeling, bargaining. Those experiences of grief are very true, and people have a lot of those feelings and those ways of thinking about it. But how it's been, I think, sort of pushed on the internet probably is that it's like phases and stages, that you go through stage 1, you take the next step, you take the next step, so that it's like a linear where you get to an end where you're sorted, where you don't have grief anymore. And what we understand is that often you can feel both bargaining, like if I'm good, maybe I'm not going to have to believe that he's died, and also absolutely outrageously furious at the same time. We have lots of conflicting thoughts and feelings at the same time. And what helps is unwrapping each one and kind of naming them and allowing them and giving them space. And then that can kind of release us to be in the present. But also to add, the thing that I think people don't realize is, as we're doing the task of mourning, of facing the reality of the loss and living with their physical absence, to remember the relationship never dies, so that the love we feel for the person that has died continues. So they will continue to influence us, to shape us. If you're going to move house, you might say to your kind of internal memory of your mum, do you like this house? Or to your brother, or whoever it is that's died. And I think we're only just beginning to kind of recognize this, what's called, it's from Silverman, continuing bonds, which can support us, because you don't get over grief, you learn to live with it, you accommodate it, it changes you, it changes your relationship with yourself and everyone in the world, and the significant person. And the level of the loss is equal to the level of the emotional investment, how significant they were to you. but that does continue, although in a kind of radically different way.
Yeah, no, that's amazing that it doesn't ever go away. It's always living with you, and it changes you. I love that growth aspect of it as well, in the way we talk about it. Now, we talked a little bit about during the pandemic how we had many people had losses that they weren't fully able to complete the grieving process. Is it too late?
No, unfortunately, in some ways, but also fortunately, it's never too late. It's never too late to get support. So the biggest predictor of your outcome when you're bereaved is the love and connection to others. And so this terrible isolation from lockdown made people so alone with their grief, and grief, you feel so isolated and chilly anyway. So the biggest single thing that can help you is talking to a friend, meeting a friend, going for a walk with a friend, doing something with a friend or a family member. But also, it's not too late to have a memorial, so that you can have a gathering in whatever way that you call it, where you come together and you remember the significant person, and people can talk about them. And because grief is invisible, and once the person is buried or cremated, there's nothing to show for it. So having a ritual, that's why funerals, that I went to Stonehenge on Monday, and 2,400 years BC, they had rituals for burial. They only buried men, by the way, not women. I don't know what they did with us, but so it has been a kind of wired response to death to have a kind of ritual where we gather together, we remember, we connect, and we do something to mark their death. And I think it's never too late to do that. And also, by the way, it's never too late to write a note to someone. I've been told many times over, I didn't write to my friend when her father died or her sister died or her child died, and it's a year later, but people actually really like that year later because other people have stopped talking about their person. And so to get a lovely letter and being told an anecdote is very warming and lovely.
Yeah, I think that kind of goes to the next question that I had is someone who's not a professional psychotherapist, because we deal with people that are grieving, grieving ourselves even. So how can we help best support someone who is grieving?
I mean, many things. Showing up is the main thing, not thinking that you can fix it. So I think often the route people take is wanting to come up with something that's going to make it better. Like, don't worry, you'll find somebody else, or don't worry, you'll have another child, or, we're trying to fix things. And the thing that helps most is acknowledging it, kind of saying the name of the person that's died, acknowledging their loss. I'm so sorry. I mean, literally all you have to say is, I'm so sorry, and say their name. And then the person who's grieving will either kind of open up and talk and want to talk with you. And then the main thing that you can do is listen and really kind of be empathic, not try and, again, fix things or try and make it different. But this may not be a right time for them. So you've acknowledged it, you said you're sorry, and they may go, thank you, and change the subject. And so then you follow them and track them where they are. But I think what we tend to do is we kind of think, I don't want to upset them, and I don't want to remind them that this person has died. They're not going to have forgotten that this person has died. And so, it's really helpful to say, even 6 or 7 months later, I wonder how you're doing. How, and if you're a good friend, you have to do that much more. But if you're just like a colleague, I wonder how the last 6 months has been for you since your dad died. I wonder, how you're feeling, or those kinds of things. And people, again, can either be open or not.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the idea of community, being there for people, because I mean, it's something that we all share. I mean, we've all lost someone or something, and it's like a great common bond, but that no one talks about openly, which is really weird. So I'm glad we can kind of, open it up and elucidate it here on this call.
The other thing I think, which has been sort of interesting around the pandemic, is that there's been a collective grief. I think I don't know if you had it in the States, but every day on the news, we had the numbers of people that had died from COVID. So we had this kind of toll every day that went on for like 2 years. And I think everyone kind of felt closer to death and more mortal than they'd ever felt before. And actually it did mean, I think, people had conversations around their kitchen table that they hadn't had before. Like, if I suddenly get COVID and I get sent to ICU, you know, what do I want you to know, or what do I need? But I think, you know, the country has had a feeling of grief. So I think the things that support us for the individual are also important collectively and in our communities and with our neighbours, in our shops.
Yeah. And then something that's kind of present for me is that, you know, there's other things that we can, you know, grieve as well when you talk about kind of that collective grief from the pandemic. But there's other things that kind of, you know, loss in your life, like a divorce, a job loss, you know, people just missing their lives, relationships, travel from the pandemic that's starting to get back up now. And then even, you know, when we relate it to our profession, being financial planners and looking at the financial markets, having a loss this year, that can be a scary time as well. So how is the grieving process that kind of the same or different with losses that aren't death?
And a health diagnosis, grief starts at the point of diagnosis, when you're given a diagnosis of, say, cancer or whatever the diagnosis is.
Yeah.
I think the big difference is that people don't acknowledge and recognize and allow themselves, or for their friends and family, that this is a grief. I mean, I call it in my book, This Too Shall Pass, which is all about this. I call it a living loss. And the experiences of the living loss are exactly the same as grief. You feel angry, sad, stuck, numb, vulnerable, chaotic, you can't concentrate, you feel in a panic, it affects your mood, your sleep, your eating. So I think to the degree that it's affected you, so obviously impact is always equal to the effect. So, you know, if you lose your job and you can't pay the rent, so you have to move, you know, that is a very big loss. And people don't recognize what that does to you psychologically. And you need both. Obviously, you need practical support, how to find a new job and somewhere else to live. But also you do need to acknowledge the emotional support. And when you don't acknowledge the emotional support, often people can't even engage fully to be able to do the interview to get the new job. Because when we're in a kind of hyper state, which often we are with grief, you don't retain information, you can't focus properly, and you make quite bad decisions, and you often do self-medicating things to block the pain of it. So having, you know, in my book, I have 8 pillars of strength, having habits and behaviors that help bring your system down from that heightened state really helps you then to connect with yourself, with your own memory, and then connect to others. And then you get the support that you need to collaboratively think together, what the hell am I going to do now, and how can I get another job?
Perfect. So you had taken a focus specifically in child bereavement, being the founder patron of the charity Child Bereavement UK, which we talked about before. What inspired you to launch that and establish that all the way back in 1994?
Because I had a job at our big NHS, you know, is our big free health service. So I had a job at St Mary's for 25 years, where I supported families where babies and children died. And so I saw thousands of families in the hospital. And what I recognized while I was working there, within a few years of working there, is that child death, because it's unbearable to even think about, there's very little support, both for the families who are experiencing the death. You know, it's a death out of time. It kind of completely tears up the rule book of life. But also around the time of the death, how you're given the information, the choices you're given, the time you spend with your child or your baby after they've died, all of those have an enormous impact on your outcomes, because regret derails grief. So we established a charity to both support professionals, teachers, anyone who came in contact with bereaved families when a child was bereaved, or if a child died. So sibling grief is something that's been very under-recognized. People often say when children are bereaved, oh, they're so amazing, they bounce back, you know, aren't they extraordinary? But actually children grieve as adults do, but they need to be given the support. And so We founded it. I mean, we had a launch, which Princess Diana came to, and we raised £75,000 at that launch, and it was around the kitchen table, and we slowly built it to what it is now. It's a long haul. So, and it goes on to, I mean, charities, like anyone listening, is always a long haul. Raising, you have to start again every year.
Yes, amazing. Yeah, yeah, that's something that, my wife and I have dealt with, trying to get pregnant, had some miscarriages along the way, IVF, all of the things, but luckily we were blessed with twins earlier this year, so they'll be turning 7 months old tomorrow. So
amazing. Must have been a stressful pregnancy. Oof.
Yes, yeah, it's pretty wild, crazy, but so much joy from that. And kind of related to the charity, obviously you've got some high profile people involved, but one in particular, when I was talking about bringing you on, my wife wanted me to ask about Mary Berry. She's a fan of the Great British Bake Off. So Mary, do you know her? Has she ever baked you anything?
I have. I've met her lots of times. She's amazing to us. So she became a patron actually before she became well known. I mean, she was well known as a cook, and she lived locally to where the charity was founded. Her son died very tragically, and so she became a patron then. And every year she'll do 2 or 3 events for us. She'll schlep, she'll travel miles to go and do a tea for 100 people in Manchester, or she'll, do an event locally. And so she's very, as you see on telly, why everyone relates to her is that she's herself. She's quite bossy, very forthright, she's funny, she has opinions, but she's got a heart of gold, and she's an amazing woman. We were so lucky to have her as a patron. She's helped us enormously.
Amazing. Yeah, great to hear that she is just like she is on TV, and so relatable and unique, and that's always good to hear when you have that connection both.
And a lot of well-known people want to be associated with charities but don't do the work. They don't show up, and she really does. They want to be associated for themselves, but she's really involved. She's fantastic.
Yeah, and she is not a spring chicken either, so she
no, exactly.
That's great to hear. Also too, so you mentioned kind of Princess Diana coming to that founding startup of Child Bereavement UK. You're the godmother to Prince George. What's that like?
I mean, I love George. I'm very lucky to be his godmother, and Prince William, Duke of Cambridge, is the royal patron of Child Bereavement UK, so he's very involved and helped us a lot. I missed George in lockdown. I didn't see him hardly at all. Like everybody, I didn't see my own children. I didn't meet my new grandchildren. Lots of things. I can see there's a question. Yes,
I was just about to get to that. That's perfect. Thank you so much for the question. How can you best prevent a loved one from turning to substance abuse after experiencing a loss?
So, I mean, all of us will have our default mode of coping with difficulty. And so when we're bereaved, that will be that. And so if you have a tendency to use substances, to self-medicate with drugs or alcohol, you will have a tendency to, because that's how you deal with pain, is to block it. And so, I mean, I think in a way, the only thing you can do is to acknowledge it to them and ask them and work collaboratively with them. What can they do? What are the things that they're finding huge difficulty with? Where are the places they can get support? Can they go to AA? Can they get a sponsor? What is the support they can get so they don't fall back or add on to an existing difficulty? And I mean, it's a very real problem. And, often when we look at addiction, people look at the sort of habit, but actually what everyone talks about now, it isn't the addiction that's the problem, it's what's the pain. And often, if you're an addict, there's been trauma in the person's life, or there's transgenerational patterns of using drugs and alcohol to block pain. And so if you can get in touch with the pain and allow them to find ways of expressing the pain and supporting themselves and realizing that the pain doesn't kill them, although they fear that it will, that may lessen their need to use the drugs to block it.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, one of the themes that keeps coming up is, community, getting, involved with other people, sharing with what you feel comfortable. So one of the things I want to encourage, everybody on the call and those watching the recording, is if you do feel, alone, lonely, lost, feel free to reach out to us, and we can try to connect you with others who are also reaching out to us. If you want to do that, we can try to connect you with various resources. Obviously, we're not trained in psychotherapy, grief psychotherapy, so we're not. We'll help you with financial stuff, but when that comes, community is key. Sharing with others, looking for that bond, and so we'd be happy to help you with that, and offer that and share those resources amongst our clients. So we're coming up to
I wouldn't underestimate the value of giving them practical advice financially, because grief, as I said before, feels like fear. And then when you have a lot of fear around, maybe it's the main breadwinner who's died. How am I going to survive? How am I going to keep the roof over my head? How are we going to cope? That can really send you into a very kind of negative spiral from the fear of that actually can derail your grief. So having practical support from someone who's compassionate and can listen to you can be a very substantial, it can be very meaningful.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. And when, things can just go so crazy during loss, you kind of shut down from everything. And one of the things that we see in terms from the finance space so often is that those that are dealing with a loss tend to act too quickly sometimes and get into things that they wouldn't have if they had a clear mind and they were thinking clearly. So one of the things that we coach people on is taking that time to heal before you make any major decisions, just to make sure that you're in the right headspace to be making those big financial decisions, especially if it was the financial breadwinner that was the one that passed away, and you're not used to making those financial decisions. You need to first take the time to grieve. You can worry, there is time issues, but not that nothing has to be done right away. And so that's what we do like to tell and inform our clients.
But also, while you're making the decisions, give yourself time between the first decision that you think you're going to make and the final decision that presses the green light. So your instinct may be to do such and such. And often, as you say, because people feel frightened, they want to get the decision done. So they have it out the way, that's sorted. I'm fixed. I've sorted that. But actually let yourself sit with that decision for a few days, talk to people, journal it, put words to what the decision is, because then that often gives you more insight. Your first decision isn't always by any means the right one.
Yeah, thank you for that insight. As we get towards the end, any final questions, please feel free to put them in so we can address them. But I do want to make sure that everybody that's kind of on the line here do know that they're getting a book from Julia. That will have a signed book plate in there as well. And so we will be sending that out to you. So be on the lookout for a follow-up after this for those that are on and had registered. And we will get that out, get the information and get the book out to you as soon as we can to get that resource in your hands. David, do you have any questions or follow-up you'd like to ask Julia while we have her?
Well, I think it's been very beneficial, and Julia, I really appreciate your candor and so much of what you've said. I think Justin's exactly right. We do see people, oftentimes we're one of the first people to be called when there's a death. We had an experience last month where one of our clients unfortunately passed away at noon on a Friday, and I got a call at 6 o'clock that night.
Wow.
So we're oftentimes the first one people
You're
call.
the first point, yeah.
And sometimes because we're the friendly face, the family knows us and we're trusted advisors, but sometimes it's just a talk.
Yeah.
And so to reinforce what you said, the ability to have someone to talk to be part of a community is so vital. And for those listening, I guess the message is if you're grieving, find somebody, but if you know somebody who is grieving, be that someone.
Be that, yeah, that's a lovely message. And I think we're so busy transmitting and kind of wanting to kind of be helpful, that we underestimate that probably the best part of communication is being able to listen, and listen fully, and really be, and for someone to really be heard, and just reflect back what you've heard them say. I do think as families, and maybe you do this at work too, walking and talking, particularly around difficult things like grief, is incredibly helpful. So being outside is good for you. Moving your body shifts your feelings. Grief feels like fear, so it reduces the cortisol in your body, so you feel calmer. Walking in rhythm, you feel the accompaniment. Being in nature is healing in itself, and you're not eyeballing each other, so that you can kind of look at the floor, you can have silence, and then you can walk for, say, half an hour or whatever it is, 40 minutes, and then go and have a cup of tea, if you're English, or a pizza, or whatever it is that you want, as a comfort. It's a lovely way of being with someone, because it's very open and unstressful, and sort of it takes out some of that intensity that everybody feels.
Yeah, I love that idea of combining those multiple factors: being outside, walking in a rhythm, and engaging with someone, and just, you know, working through that way. Just hitting it from all angles is really, really powerful. So I really appreciate that advice. I think we are at a good conclusion here. David, Julia, thank you so much for joining us on this webinar. Hopefully it provided some value to you, and we want to continue to be that value, that resource to you. So please reach out if there's anything that we can do to help you. Julia, amazing as always. One thing that I heard from you is people want to be seen, heard, what they say matter. So make sure you're listening and being that those ears for people that are grieving. So thank you so much, Julia. It was wonderful having, and I'll let you get off to your evening.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody, and take care. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure. Lovely to meet you.
Thank you. You as well.
Just before we sign off, I'd like to also just promote our upcoming webinars. If you haven't seen the emails coming out, our next webinar is going to be on Wednesday, September 7th. It's going to be featuring two speakers, Larry Swedrow, who you probably have seen on a number of the business networks where he is featured, and Samuel Adams. We're going to be speaking about sustainable investing, a topic that's getting a lot of press right now, and a lot of clients are asking about. The following month, on Wednesday, October 12th, we're going to have a local attorney, Keith Singer, speaking about estate planning basics. And then on Wednesday, November 9th, we have Nancy Dykeman coming to us from South Carolina, who's going to be talking about choosing the right providers of extended care. Fascinating discussion about all the different types of care that is available, and the ways that you can provide for care when you need support.
Perfect. Thanks for including that plug, David. We need to make sure join the webinars. We're trying to provide value, and if you have ideas for people to bring on as wonderful as Julia, please also let us know. We're always looking for ideas there to bring what it is that you want. So thank you so much. Have a great day, night, and we'll see you soon.